There's a small town in the Midwest that still talks about the clown sightings from a decade ago, something they call the Year of the Smiling Man. Back then, reports of a clown lurking in dark alleys and abandoned places swept through the town, sending a chill that burrowed deep into every heart. It began with a group of teenagers who decided to sneak out one October night, seeking a thrill in the empty cornfields just outside town. These fields had a reputation for strange noises and shadows moving without wind, but that night it was more than shadows that startled them. Around midnight, they saw him. A clown standing just at the edge of the field. His costume was an unsettling blend of colors, his face painted in a garish grin. He wasn't like the clowns they'd seen at the fair. He looked almost decayed, as though his face paint had been applied ages ago and was starting to rot. He didn't move, just stood there smiling, tilting his head slowly as if assessing each of them, savoring their fear. The teens dared each other to approach, laughing nervously, but as they moved closer, he seemed to glide forward without taking a step, his grin widening. It was then they realized. His teeth were not white, but a sickly shade of yellow, and he wasn't wearing makeup. His face was horribly pale, and the paint appeared to be old blood smeared across his cheeks. One of the teens, Mark, whispered, "Run," and they all bolted, not stopping until they were back in town. They panted, convinced it was some prank, a scarecrow maybe, or a local who'd had too much to drink. But the next morning, Mark wasn't in school, and when they checked on him, his room was empty, his window open with muddy footprints on the floor. Soon, there were more sightings. The clown appeared in people's backyards, at playgrounds, and once, even in a grocery store parking lot in the middle of the night. Witnesses all described the same details: the dirty, decaying costume, the rotting smile, the way he seemed to move without really moving. And after each sighting, someone disappeared. Parents locked their children indoors and local businesses closed early. But locking doors did little good. A woman named Susan, who lived alone, heard noises outside her house one night, a faint, high-pitched giggle, like a child trying to stifle laughter. She peeked out the window but saw only darkness. She told herself it was a raccoon or maybe a stray dog. But as she lay back down, she felt a prickling sensation, that uncanny feeling of being watched. She turned, and there he was, standing outside her window. The clown's face was pressed against the glass, his eyes wide, his mouth twisted into a gory grin. She gasped, stumbling back, but he didn't move. He just stood there, tapping the glass with long, dirt-caked nails. Susan called the police, her voice trembling. When the officer arrived, she felt a wave of relief, but the clown was nowhere to be found. "Probably a prank," the officer said, though his face was pale. She stayed awake all night, watching the window, but saw nothing. In the morning, however, she found something chilling on her front porch, a small, rusted music box. When she wound it, it played a garbled version of Happy Birthday before stopping abruptly. That was when she noticed the smear of red across her front door, the streaks of dirt, and the mark that looked unmistakably like a handprint. By the end of the month, the clown sightings became less frequent, and the townspeople hoped the horror had passed. Then one cold November night, a traveling circus came through town. The residents were still on edge, but some dared to attend, hoping a real circus might erase the nightmares of the smiling man. They entered the large striped tent with hesitant smiles, grateful for the lighthearted music and the smell of popcorn. As the lights dimmed, the ringleader stepped forward, his voice booming, welcoming them all. He announced the first act, a very special guest. The crowd cheered as a clown stepped onto the stage, but the cheers died almost immediately. Standing under the spotlight in a faded, grimy costume was the smiling man. His face had the same twisted grin, his eyes flickering with recognition as he looked over the crowd like he knew every face in the audience. Gasps and whispers filled the tent. "Isn't that?" someone murmured. People started glancing toward the exits, but before they could move, the clown started to perform. He twisted balloons into shapes, each one a little more disturbing than the last. A noose, a knife, a pair of handcuffs. His movements were jerky, almost puppet-like, and his smile never faltered. Finally, he pulled a battered red balloon from his pocket, releasing it into the air where it floated toward the crowd. As it hovered above the audience, they realized it was slowly deflating, and the air escaping sounded faintly like a shriek. Without warning, the clown threw his arms wide, and the lights in the tent went out. Screams filled the darkness as the air grew thick with an unbearable, suffocating stench, like rotten meat and something chemical, acidic. When the lights flickered back on, the clown was gone. But in the seats where people had been sitting just moments before, there were only empty chairs, each with a red balloon tied to it, floating eerily in the now silent tent. The circus left town the next day, leaving behind no evidence that they'd ever been there. No one could say where they went, and the families of the missing were left without answers. To this day, townspeople still whisper about the smiling man, and some claim they've seen him in neighboring towns, wandering through back alleys or lurking in the shadows of closed amusement parks. They say he only appears when you're alone and when you least expect it. They say he's drawn to fear, that he can taste it, that once he's seen your face, he never forgets. There was a legend that haunted the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oak Hollow, a story whispered among the kids and ignored by the adults. They called him the Ice Cream Man, though he wasn't like any other vendor. The story went that he only came out after midnight, driving a rusted pale blue truck with the word sweet treats barely visible under years of grime. His jingle, a twisted, warbling melody, was said to echo through the empty streets, drawing in anyone who dared to listen. According to the legend, if you heard that jingle and stepped outside, you'd find his truck idling at the corner, waiting just for you. The Ice Cream Man would be there, hidden in shadow, his eyes watching from behind the darkened glass of the serving window. Some claimed he wore an old-fashioned soda jerk's hat. Others said his face was twisted into an unnatural grin, but everyone agreed on one thing. He never spoke. He'd just open the window and wait. One night, a group of neighborhood kids, Ethan, Jason, and Zoe, decided to put the legend to the test. They were in middle school and had a taste for thrill-seeking, so they dared each other to stay up until midnight and go out when they heard the ice cream jingle. Ethan's parents were out of town, and the trio gathered in his basement, whispering about what they might see and laughing nervously, each of them secretly hoping the Ice Cream Man wouldn't actually show. But at exactly 12:03 a.m., the familiar chime began. It was faint at first, almost like it was coming from far away, but it grew louder, warped and eerie, the notes dragging and shifting in a way that made the kids' skin crawl. They exchanged nervous glances, but none of them backed down. They grabbed their flashlights and stepped outside, hearts pounding, drawn by the jingle that echoed through the empty streets. Sure enough, there it was, the ice cream truck, parked under the flickering streetlight at the corner. The truck was even more decrepit than they'd imagined, its paint peeling and rust crawling up its sides like spreading vines. The jingle continued, slow and distorted, making the air feel thick and wrong. They approached slowly, their courage waning with every step. As they got closer, they noticed that the truck's windows were smeared with something dark, as though someone had tried to scrub them clean, but given up halfway. Ethan, who was the boldest of the group, stepped forward and called out, "Hello? Ice Cream Man?" The music stopped abruptly, plunging them into a silence that seemed to swallow all sound. The only noise was the faint hum of the truck's engine. Then, slowly, the service window slid open. The darkness inside was so thick they couldn't make out anything, just the faint shape of someone standing behind the glass. Do you have any ice cream?" Zoe asked, her voice barely a whisper. A pale, gloved hand reached out from the darkness, holding 3 ice cream cones. The cones were old-fashioned, their edges chipped and sticky, and each one was topped with a different flavor. But something was wrong with the colors. The red was too deep, almost like blood. The white had a sickly, grayish tint, and the blue was so dark it was nearly black. None of them wanted to take the cones, but it felt like they didn't have a choice. Each of them reached out, their hands shaking, and grabbed a cone. The moment they did, they felt an intense chill seep through their fingers, as though they were holding something far colder than ice cream. "Thank you," Ethan said, but the Ice Cream Man didn't respond. He just stood there, watching them with unseen eyes from the shadows. They backed away slowly, clutching their cones, their stomachs twisting with an unexplainable dread. Once they were a safe distance away, Jason broke the silence. This is messed up. I don't think we should eat it." But Ethan, always the daring one, lifted his cone. "It's just ice cream, you guys. We wanted to see if he was real, and he is. Let's just try it." He took a bite, his face contorting immediately as the strange taste filled his mouth. It wasn't sweet at all, more like something metallic, something rancid. But before he could spit it out, his eyes widened, and he stood there, frozen, his body trembling. "Ethan?" Zoe whispered, watching in horror as he began to shake uncontrollably. His eyes rolled back, and his skin took on a pale ashen color, his lips turning blue. He dropped the cone, clutching his stomach as if something was crawling inside him, something writhing and clawing to get out. Jason and Zoe screamed, dropping their own cones, which splattered onto the pavement. But they were horrified to see that the ice cream didn't melt. Instead, it seemed to writhe, almost as if it were alive, squirming and pulsing on the ground. They grabbed Ethan, pulling him back toward his house, but he was barely able to move, his breathing shallow and ragged. As they dragged him away, they heard it again, that awful, distorted jingle, growing louder and louder, following them down the street. They glanced back and saw the ice cream truck moving, rolling slowly behind them, its headlights flickering as it approached. They managed to get Ethan back inside the house, slamming and locking the door. But the music didn't stop. It grew louder, echoing through the walls, filling every corner of the house. The three of them huddled in the living room, holding their breath, hoping the truck would go away. But then they heard footsteps on the porch, slow and heavy, followed by the sound of scratching at the door, as though someone were tracing their nails along the wood. Suddenly, Ethan's eyes shot open, but they were different, cloudy, blank, like he wasn't really there. He looked at Zoe and Jason, his mouth stretching into a twisted grin, his teeth stained with a dark red smear. He started humming the jingle, that same haunting melody, his voice hollow and lifeless. Terrified, Zoe and Jason tried to shake him out of it, but he only laughed, his voice growing louder, taking on a manic edge that sounded disturbingly familiar. It was the ice cream man's laugh, spilling out of Ethan's mouth. They ran to the back door, but as soon as they stepped outside, they saw it. The ice cream truck, parked in the yard, its lights flickering. The service window was open, and behind the glass was the ice cream man, his face finally visible. His eyes were wide and empty, his skin a sickly shade of white, and his mouth stretched into a too-wide grin that split his face, revealing rows of rotting teeth. Before they could scream, the headlights went out and the jingle stopped. They looked around, and the truck was gone. So was Ethan. They were alone in the yard, clutching each other, the silence pressing down on them. In the days that followed, neither Zoe nor Jason saw Ethan again. His family reported him missing, but the only clue they ever found was a small, crumpled cone on his bedroom floor, with a sickly red stain smeared across the carpet. After that night, kids in Oak Hollow swore they could still hear the jingle on certain nights, drifting through the quiet streets in the dead of night. And anyone who heard it knew to stay inside, no matter how loud it got, because they knew that the ice cream man was out there, waiting for anyone brave or foolish enough to answer his call. There's a story that people in the small town of Cedar Grove refuse to talk about. They call it the visitor. Supposedly, every few years, this stranger appears, knocking on doors in the dead of night, looking for someone to let him inside. Nobody knows who he is, where he comes from, or what he wants. People just know that anyone who opens the door for him vanishes. The last person to see him was a woman named Carol, who had just moved into Cedar Grove a few weeks before. She didn't know about the visitor, hadn't heard the rumors or seen the warning signs. So when she heard a knock at her door around 3 a.m., she thought it might be her neighbor with an emergency. She looked out the window and saw a man standing on her doorstep, his head down so that his face was hidden under the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. His coat was old and dusty, hanging from his frame in heavy, dark folds. Even in the dim porch light, she could tell something was wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. She felt a strange chill, but she brushed it off and opened the door just a crack. "Hello?" she asked, her voice quiet. The man didn't answer right away. He tilted his head slightly, and she thought she caught a glimpse of his face under the hat, a sliver of pale skin, dark eyes set deep into his skull. Then he spoke, his voice raspy and hollow, like someone who hadn't spoken in a long time. "Can you let me in?" For reasons she couldn't explain, Carol felt a sudden rush of terror. She quickly shut the door, locking it. But she still heard his voice through the door, that same question, repeated softly, almost pleading. "Can you let me in?" Carol backed away, feeling her heart race. She tried to call her neighbor, but the call wouldn't go through. The phone just made a low, static sound. She checked her cell phone, but there was no signal. All she could hear was the quiet tap, tap, tap of his fingernails tapping on the door, his voice barely more than a whisper. Hours passed, with Carol sitting frozen in her living room, clutching a heavy flashlight and staring at the door. The tapping would stop, then start up again, and every so often his voice would come through the door in that eerie, rasping tone. "Can you let me in?" The next morning, when sunlight finally streamed through her windows, the man was gone. Carol thought she must have imagined it. Maybe she'd been sleep-deprived. Maybe she'd dreamed the whole thing. But when she checked her door, she found faint scratches across the wood, the kind that looked like they'd been left by fingernails. She told herself it was nothing, just her mind playing tricks on her. A few nights later, though, it happened again. The same knock, the same quiet voice. "Can you let me in?" This time, she didn't even look through the window. She just sat frozen, praying he would go away. The tapping continued until sunrise, leaving her shaken and exhausted. She called the police, but when they arrived, they found no sign of anyone. "You sure it wasn't just an animal?" the officer asked, a strange look on his face. It wasn't long before she started hearing about him from other townspeople, though they only spoke in hushed voices. The visitor was a legend in Cedar Grove, an entity that would appear every few years, always looking for someone to let him inside. Some claimed he was a ghost, others said he was something darker, something far worse. But everyone agreed on one thing: if you let him in, you were never seen again. Over the next few weeks, Carol became a shut-in, sleeping with every light in her house on, her doors and windows locked and bolted. But every night, at exactly 3 a.m., he would come. He would knock and knock and knock, that same slow, steady rhythm that never seemed to stop. And each time his voice grew fainter, more desperate, like he was growing weaker the longer he waited. One night, driven half mad by sleep deprivation, Carol tried to confront him. She opened her window a crack and shouted, "What do you want?" There was a pause, and then she heard him answer so softly she almost didn't hear it. "To come inside," he whispered. "To come back home." The words chilled her to the bone. What did he mean by home? Was her house his? Or was he trying to make her leave to let him take her place? After that night, she couldn't sleep. Every night she heard him calling to her, his voice fading into a faint whisper, his knocking so soft it almost sounded like it was coming from inside her walls. She knew she couldn't keep going like this. Desperate, she reached out to the oldest residents of Cedar Grove, trying to learn who the visitor was. Most people refused to talk about him, but finally, an elderly woman named Mrs. White told her the story. Decades ago, there had been a man who lived in Carol's house, a reclusive, strange man who rarely left his home. One night, during a terrible storm, he disappeared. No one knew what happened to him, but after that, people started hearing knocks at their doors, faint whispers asking to come inside, and each time, someone would go missing. It was as though he were trying to return, to replace someone, to take their place. Carol listened, horrified, but there was one more detail that chilled her to the core. Mrs. White leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper. "Once he chooses you, dear, he never stops." The words lingered with Carol, tormenting her as she returned to her home. She knew he was waiting for her to break to let him in. She resolved to never answer the door, to stay strong, no matter what. But the knocking grew louder, more insistent, rattling the windows and echoing through her home. He was relentless, calling to her night after night, his voice growing stronger, more demanding. It was no longer a soft whisper. Now it was a rasping command, echoing through her mind, even when she covered her ears. Finally, on the fourth night, Carol couldn't take it anymore. She sat by the door, sobbing, desperate for the noise to stop. Her hand hovered over the lock, the urge to open the door overpowering, the knocking now a pounding that made her entire house shudder. With a final, trembling breath, she unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The knocking stopped. The silence was overwhelming, pressing down on her as she looked out into the empty night. There was no one there. She let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish. Maybe it had all been in her head. She closed the door and turned to go back to bed, feeling relieved for the first time in weeks. But then she heard it, a faint scratching at the window. She turned slowly, and there he was, standing outside the glass, his face pale and his eyes dark, his hand pressed against the window. His mouth stretched into an unnatural, hungry grin as he raised one finger, beckoning her toward him. The last thing anyone ever heard from Carol was a blood-curdling scream that echoed through Cedar Grove. By the time neighbors arrived, her house was empty, the door hanging open. There was no trace of Carol except for a single dark stain on the floor near the door and a trail of faint, dusty footprints leading away into the night. They say that if you listen carefully on quiet nights, you can still hear a faint knocking echoing through the empty rooms of her house, as though the visitor is still there, waiting for someone to let him in. In the secluded town of Black Hollow, people spoke of the Whispering Woods, a dense stretch of forest just beyond the outskirts. For as long as anyone could remember, the woods had been off limits at night, with warnings passed down through generations. Stay out after dark, or you'll hear the Whisperer. No one knew exactly what the Whisperer was, but stories spoke of strange voices, chilling sounds that seemed to call people deeper and deeper into the trees, never to return. For years, the warnings kept people away. But curiosity is a powerful thing. When a group of friends from out of town rented a cabin nearby, they laughed off the old tales as nothing more than local superstition. One evening, as dusk crept in, the friends dared each other to explore the Whispering Woods. They were a close-knit group. Alex, a skeptic who dismissed anything supernatural, Lydia, the adventurous one who could never say no to a dare, Mike, always cautious, always looking for a logical explanation, and Tara, the one with an interest in the paranormal. To her, the stories were exciting, and she thought there might be some truth hidden within the town's cautionary tales. As they ventured into the woods, the fading light cast eerie shadows, and the trees seemed to close in around them, twisting into strange, unnatural shapes. The deeper they walked, the quieter the world became. Even the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl, fell silent. It was as though the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. After a while, Lydia joked, "So where's this Whisperer? Maybe he's off haunting somewhere else tonight." The others chuckled, and their voices echoed unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. But then they heard it, a soft, barely there whisper that floated through the trees, so quiet it was almost indistinguishable from the rustling leaves. None of them could make out what it said, but it sounded close, just beyond the thick brush. The friends exchanged nervous glances, their earlier bravado fading. Mike suggested they turn back, but Lydia, ever bold, insisted on going a little farther. "Come on, it's probably just the wind," she said with a forced laugh. She stepped forward, and the others reluctantly followed. As they continued deeper, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. Words drifted through the air, twisting and overlapping, phrases like "come closer" and "I see you," mingling with the eerie sound of laughter that seemed to echo all around them. It was as if the forest were alive, pulling them in. Each step made the voices louder, more invasive, until it felt like they were coming from inside their own minds. Tara tried to shake it off, reminding herself it was all just the power of suggestion. But then she heard her own name, whispered in a low, raspy voice from somewhere just ahead. "Tara, come closer." Her heart pounded, and she looked around, seeing only trees and shadows. The others had stopped, their faces pale, each one hearing something different, something personal. Mike's voice trembled as he swore he'd heard his late grandfather's voice calling his name. Alex scoffed, trying to keep calm, but even he was visibly shaken. "It's just a trick of the wind," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Suddenly, Lydia gasped and pointed to a dark shape in the distance. "Did you see that? Someone's there!" They all turned, squinting through the gloom. Just beyond a cluster of twisted trees, they saw what looked like a figure, tall and gaunt, barely more than a shadow. It was impossible to make out any features, but its presence was undeniable. As they stared, the figure raised a hand and beckoned to them, moving silently, gliding just out of reach, deeper into the forest. Panicked, they turned to run, but the trees around them seemed to have shifted, the path they'd taken now gone, replaced by thick walls of branches and dense undergrowth. The whispers grew louder, mocking them, laughing in their minds with strange, unsettling thoughts. The voice of the whisperer was no longer just around them. It felt as though it were inside them, echoing in their minds, growing louder, more frenzied. One by one, they felt their fear turn to terror. Mike was the first to snap, clawing at the undergrowth, frantically trying to find a way out. He yelled, shouting for the others to help him, but his voice was drowned out by the whispers, which had now turned into shrieks. a cacophony of voices screaming warnings, begging for release, as though hundreds of souls were trapped in the trees around them. Alex tried to reason with himself, muttering that it was a trick, a hallucination. But his own voice sounded strange to him, distorted and hollow. He turned to see his friends, but saw only shadows. In the dim moonlight filtering through the branches, his friends' faces looked warped, their eyes sunken and black, their mouths twisted into unnatural smiles. He blinked, and they looked normal again, but the fear in their faces was unmistakable. In a moment of desperation, Tara took Lydia's hand and tried to pull her in the direction they thought they had come from, praying they'd find their way back. But Lydia stopped, staring into the darkness, her face blank. "I hear them," she whispered, a strange look in her eyes. "They're calling me. They need my help." "Lydia, don't listen," Tara begged, her voice breaking, but Lydia pulled away, moving toward the shadows, entranced as though under a spell. With a final glance, Lydia stepped into the darkness and disappeared. Her form melted into the shadows, leaving no trace behind. The remaining three friends screamed for her, but their voices were swallowed by the forest, lost in the growing chorus of whispers and screams. Panicked and desperate, Tara, Mike, and Alex fought their way back through the twisted trees, stumbling over roots and branches, the whispers chasing them, filling their minds with terrible thoughts. The figure appeared again, blocking their path, its hollow eyes fixed on them, a distorted smile stretching across its pale, gaunt face. It lifted a finger to its lips as if shushing them, and the whispers fell silent. For one terrifying moment, there was only silence, an emptiness so profound it felt like the forest itself had disappeared. Then, just as suddenly, the whispers began again, louder than ever, calling their names, laughing, mocking. When Tara, Mike, and Alex finally burst from the trees and into the open field, they collapsed, gasping for breath, clutching each other in terror. They looked back at the forest, half expecting to see the figure following them. But there was nothing, only the rustling of leaves in the wind. The police organized a search party the next morning, combing through the woods in search of Lydia. They found no trace of her, only a small pile of her belongings near a tree deep in the forest, her flashlight and phone lying abandoned in the dirt. Months passed, and Tara, Mike, and Alex left town, each one haunted by what they'd experienced. But they could never forget the whispers, the feeling of being watched, the way the forest seemed to come alive that night. And every so often, in their quietest moments, they could still hear it, a soft whisper calling their names, beckoning them back to the whispering woods. And somewhere in that dark, twisted forest, the whisper still waits, watching, waiting for someone else to hear the call, to follow the voices, to step into the shadows and vanish. There's an old urban legend whispered among carnival workers about a lost attraction called the Midnight Circus. According to the stories, it was a carnival that would appear out of nowhere, usually set up in a remote, dark field with no warning or fanfare. The locals would hear about it from strangers in town or see distant lights shimmering across the field, and curiosity would inevitably draw them in. But everyone who entered the Midnight Circus came back different, and some didn't come back at all. A young man named Tom heard about this legend from his grandfather, a retired carnival worker who spoke of it only after a few drinks and with haunted eyes. When Tom pressed him for details, his grandfather refused, but Tom's curiosity was relentless. He didn't believe in ghost stories or curses, so when he heard rumors of strange lights in the old Fairbanks field a few towns over, he knew he had to see for himself. Tom drove out there alone late one night, hoping to prove the myth wrong. He saw the lights immediately, a soft, eerie glow hovering just above the ground, illuminating a line of tents that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. Faint music played in the air, an old, wobbly tune on a tinny organ that sounded like it was struggling to remember the right notes. He parked his car at the edge of the field and walked toward the entrance. A tall, thin man in a top hat greeted him, his eyes shadowed, his smile unsettlingly wide. "Welcome to the Midnight Circus, sir," he said with a deep bow. His voice was too soft, almost as if he were whispering inside Tom's head rather than speaking aloud. Tom handed over a few crumpled bills, and the man's gloved hand clasped his tightly, lingering just a moment too long. Once inside, Tom realized the place was empty. There were no other visitors, no children running through the tents, especially no families eating cotton candy or playing games. It was just him, the shadowed figures of carnies and performers lingering in the darkness, their faces obscured. He felt a prickle of discomfort, but he reminded himself it was all just a gimmick, probably meant to make the place feel mysterious. His first stop was a small tent with a sign that read, "The Funhouse of Mirrors." It was quieter inside, the music muffled, and his footsteps echoed as he walked through a narrow hallway lined with mirrors. But something was off about these mirrors. His reflection seemed distorted, not just in the expected funhouse way, but in subtle, eerie ways he couldn't quite place. His eyes looked a little too wide, his smile stretched slightly too far, and as he walked, his reflection seemed to lag just a bit behind, its gaze lingering on him even after he'd moved. At one point he paused, staring into a mirror where his reflection stared back, unmoving. He turned to leave, but his reflection remained, grinning. He felt his stomach twist as he backed away, never taking his eyes off it, and as he turned a corner, he heard faint laughter behind him, a dry, raspy giggle echoing through the maze of mirrors. He moved faster, nearly running until he stumbled out of the tent and into the open air, his heart pounding. Shaking it off as a trick, Tom wandered to the next attraction, a tall tent with a sign that read, "Madame Valora, the Seer of Souls." Inside, he found an old woman seated at a table covered in faded tarot cards, her skin stretched thin over her bones, her eyes glassy and clouded. She beckoned him to sit, her voice a hoarse whisper that made his skin crawl. As she laid out the cards, she spoke of things she shouldn't have known, his childhood fears, the time he nearly drowned, the nightmares he still had about faceless figures watching him. Her hand reached out, skeletal and cold, grabbing his wrist tightly. "Beware the mirrors," she rasped, her eyes boring into him. "They've seen you, and they'll be waiting." He pulled his arm back and stumbled out of the tent, the words echoing in his mind. As he hurried away, the carnival seemed to grow darker, the lights dimming, the air thickening with a smell of decay. But he was determined to shake off his fear. He'd only stay a little longer just to prove he wasn't scared. The next tent was labeled the Clown's Court, and against his better judgment, he entered. Inside, a group of clowns sat in a circle, their faces painted with smeared grins, their eyes glassy and hollow. They didn't move as he entered, but he could feel their gazes fixed on him, their heads tilting slightly as he walked in. One of the clowns, taller than the rest, rose slowly, his face painted in an exaggerated smile, his teeth yellowed and sharp beneath the smears of red paint. "Would you like a balloon?" he asked, his voice high-pitched, almost childlike. He held out a black balloon, and when Tom hesitated, the clown's smile widened, his teeth seeming to grow sharper. "Take it," he whispered, the words slithering through the air like a threat. Tom shook his head, backing away, but the clown followed, his movements unnaturally smooth, almost floating toward him. The other clowns began to giggle softly, a sound that twisted into his ears and made his stomach lurch. He turned and ran out of the tent, breathless, but as he stumbled back into the main carnival grounds, he realized something horrifying. The field had changed. The tents were gone, replaced by a wall of mirrors, stretching as far as he could see. Each one showed a version of himself, but twisted, grinning, with eyes black and bottomless. They watched him, some waving, some reaching out, their hands pressing against the glass as if they wanted to pull him in. He turned, only to find himself surrounded by the mirrors, trapped. In a panic, he tried to shatter one, pounding on it with his fists, but the glass didn't break. Instead, his reflection grinned wider, reaching out as if it would grab him through the glass. And then, as if on cue, a soft, tinny voice whispered in his ear, "The show must go on, Tom." The last thing he saw was his reflection reaching through the glass, its hand gripping his shoulder, pulling him in. The world around him swirled, the carnival lights blurring, fading, until there was nothing left but darkness. The next morning, Tom's car was found abandoned at the edge of the Fairbanks field. There was no sign of him, no evidence he'd ever even entered the carnival, and eventually his case was closed. But every so often, when the moon is high, people claim to see a figure in the field, a young man with hollow eyes and a twisted grin, staring out from behind a mirror that no one else can see. They say that once the Midnight Circus finds you, it doesn't let you leave. It just adds you to its collection, a reflection in an endless hall of mirrors, forever watching, waiting for the next soul to wander in. In a town nestled deep in the woods, there was an old, abandoned theme park known as Hollow Point Park. Decades ago, it had been a popular spot, bustling with families and laughter, but a series of strange accidents closed it down. Over time, the park was left to rot, and most people avoided it, whispering about the things that supposedly haunted the place. Shadows that moved on their own, whispers in the empty buildings, and most famously, the laughing clown. The story went that one night, just before the park shut down, a clown had gone missing. He was never found, but some claimed that he was still there, roaming the grounds. They said he could be heard laughing, his voice echoing through the empty park in the dead of night, and anyone unlucky enough to hear him would never be the same. Jake, a thrill seeker with a penchant for urban exploration, didn't believe in ghost stories. When he heard about Hollow Point, he knew he had to check it out for himself. Despite warnings from locals, he set out with nothing more than a flashlight and a camera, hoping to capture some eerie shots and maybe catch a glimpse of the so-called laughing clown. He arrived just after midnight, the only light coming from the pale glow of his flashlight. The park was overgrown, weeds spilling over cracked walkways, rusted rides creaking faintly in the breeze. He walked past the silent Ferris wheel, the bumper cars, and the carousel, all of which seemed to stand like skeletal remains of a happier time. The silence was absolute, so thick he could almost feel it pressing down on him. As he approached the old funhouse, he felt a sudden chill, and he thought he heard something. A faint sound that sent a shiver down his spine. It was laughter, soft and echoing, barely audible but undeniably there. He shook it off, chalking it up to his imagination, and stepped into the funhouse, the door creaking loudly behind him. Inside it was pitch black, the air thick and musty. His flashlight cast eerie shadows along the peeling walls, reflecting off broken mirrors that twisted his own face into monstrous shapes. He forced himself to laugh, brushing off the creeping unease. But as he moved deeper into the funhouse, the laughter grew louder, more distinct. It was high-pitched, playful, but with a sinister edge that made his skin crawl. It seemed to come from all around him, echoing off the walls surrounding him. "Hello?" he called out, hoping for an echo, some sound that would prove he was alone. But instead, the laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so intense it felt oppressive. He felt a flicker of dread, but kept going, telling himself it was just an old building, creaky and empty. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Just then, he turned a corner and froze. In the dim light, he saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, half-shadowed. It was a clown, or at least it looked like one. A twisted figure in a filthy, tattered costume, his face painted with a grotesque smile. The clown didn't move, didn't make a sound, but his eyes, dark and empty, were fixed on Jake. Jake's heart raced, and he forced himself to laugh, convinced it was just an old mannequin left behind. He took a step closer, but as he did, the clown's mouth began to twist wider, the painted smile stretching grotesquely, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. The figure's head tilted as if amused, and the soft laughter returned, this time echoing directly in Jake's ears. He stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering, but the clown took a step forward, the laughter growing louder as if it were coming from deep within him. Jake turned and bolted, sprinting through the twisting halls, his flashlight barely illuminating the path. The laughter followed him, growing louder, filling his ears with that high-pitched, gleeful sound. No matter how far he ran, the sound stayed right behind him, relentless. He finally burst out of the funhouse, panting, his heart hammering in his chest. He looked back, half expecting the clown to follow, but the doorway was empty. The laughter had stopped, leaving only the faint creak of the rusty rides in the night air. For a moment, he felt a surge of relief, convinced that he'd escaped. But then he heard it. Footsteps, soft and shuffling, coming from behind him. He spun around, his flashlight flickering, but there was no one there. He backed away, trying to calm his breathing, but the footsteps kept coming, slowly, steadily, crunching through the gravel as if someone were walking in circles around him. He turned, desperate to find an exit, and that's when he saw the Ferris wheel. His heart sank. The massive wheel, silent for decades, was now turning, its lights flickering on one by one, casting an eerie glow over the abandoned park. Each cabin was empty, but in one, near the top, he saw it. The clown, staring down at him with that same unnatural grin, waving slowly as the wheel turned. Jake took off, running through the park, but no matter where he went, The laughter followed. It was louder now, manic and echoing, bouncing off the broken rides and spilling through the night air. He glanced back, and there he was, the clown, standing motionless in the middle of the path, his grin impossibly wide, his eyes empty and dark. Jake ran until he could barely breathe, finally reaching his car. He fumbled with the keys, glancing back to see if the clown was still there, but the park was silent again, empty. He jumped in the car, slamming the door and locking it, his hands shaking as he started the engine. He peeled out of the lot, not daring to look back. But as he drove away, he heard something in the back seat, a faint, soft giggle. His heart stopped, and he glanced in the rearview mirror. There, reflected in the dim light, was the clown, sitting in the back seat, his eyes fixed on Jake with that same haunting grin. The last thing he heard was the laughter, filling his ears as the car swerved off the road and into the trees. The next day, they found Jake's car wrapped around a tree at the edge of the park. He was gone, his belongings scattered, but the car was empty. The only clue was a smear of red paint on the passenger seat and a small, crumpled flyer on the dashboard. It read, "Welcome to Hollow Point Park. We hope you enjoy the show." After that, people in town started reporting strange sightings again. They'd see glimpses of a clown standing by the side of the road or hear faint laughter in the night. And anyone who heard that laughter would feel compelled to visit the park, drawn by an invisible pull, until they too joined the ranks of Hollow Point's lost souls, forever haunted by the clown with the twisted smile. The legend of the Watcher circulated quietly in the rural town of Maple Pines, a tale whispered among locals but often dismissed as superstition. The Watcher was said to appear in people's lives only when they were truly alone, a dark figure with hollow eyes that would stand in the corners of empty rooms, lurking just out of sight. No one knew who the Watcher was or where it came from, only that it had a way of taking hold of people's minds, gnawing away at their sense of reality until they were never the same again. Nina, a young woman who'd recently moved to town to escape a chaotic city life, heard about the Watcher from her new neighbor, Mrs. Hayworth. The elderly woman had taken to stopping by often, warning her about strange things in town, but Nina was polite and chalked it up to old age. "Just be careful when you're alone," Mrs. Hayworth had whispered one evening, her gaze intense. "The Watcher waits for those who don't expect him." Nina only smiled and thanked her neighbor. She didn't believe in ghosts or stories about shadowy figures. Her new house was isolated, but that's what she wanted, a fresh start in a quiet place. Her nights were peaceful, her sleep undisturbed at first. But then strange things began happening. It started subtly. Small items would move from their usual places, keys, her coffee mug, a framed photo. She chalked it up to forgetfulness, blamed it on adjusting to her new place. But one night, she woke up suddenly, gripped by an overwhelming feeling that someone was in the room. Her heart pounded as she listened to the silence, every creak of the house amplified in the dark. She brushed it off, but the next night, it happened again. She awoke to the sound of a faint, rhythmic tapping. Sitting up in bed, she scanned the room, her eyes adjusting to the dark. The sound seemed to come from her living room. She crept out of bed, her bare feet silent against the floor, and peeked out, feeling the hair on her neck prickle as she turned on the light. Nothing was there. The room was empty, silent. She told herself she was imagining things and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The tapping continued each night, sometimes closer, sometimes far farther away, as though something were moving through her house. She became paranoid, jumping at shadows, and even considering asking Mrs. Metasdale Hayworth to stay over one night. But she forced herself to remain rational. Maybe it was just the old house settling, she reasoned, the floorboards adjusting. Then, one night, everything changed. It was late, almost 2 a.m., when she woke again, this time not to tapping, but to a feeling of being watched. Her bedroom was dark, silent, but she felt an intense presence, as though someone or something was in the room with her. She forced herself to turn over, glancing around, and her breath caught in her throat. In the corner of the room, near the closet, she saw a figure, a tall, shadowy form with hollow, empty eyes, its gaze fixed on her. Nina froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. She felt her heart hammering in her chest, a primal fear gripping her. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply watched her, a shadow within the shadows. After what felt like an eternity, she mustered the courage to reach for her phone, but the second her hand moved, the figure disappeared. She sat up, breathing heavily, her mind racing. She turned on every light in the house, checked every corner, every closet, but there was no one there. Her skin crawled with the memory of those empty, unblinking eyes, and she spent the rest of the night sitting on her bed, the lights on, too terrified to close her eyes. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every night, she saw the figure in different parts of the house, by the window, in the hallway, lurking just out of reach. Each time she turned on the lights, it would vanish, but she knew it was there, waiting, watching her every move. She confided in Mrs. Hayworth, who only gave her a grim look. "The Watcher has found you," she said quietly. "You can't run from it. Once it's chosen you, it stays until—" "Until what?" Nina asked, desperation coloring her voice. Mrs. Hayworth only shook her head. "Until you're gone." Nina tried everything, sleeping with all the lights on, playing loud music, even inviting friends over. But every time she was alone, the figure would reappear, silent and patient. She felt her sanity slipping, haunted by those hollow eyes, her every moment filled with dread. One night, exhausted and feeling like she had no other choice, she decided to confront the Watcher. She sat in her darkened living room, staring into the corner where she'd seen it so many times before. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" At first, there was silence. Then she heard a faint whisper, so soft she almost thought she imagined it. "To watch." The answer filled her with an unspeakable dread, as though it were something old, something inhuman, something that existed solely to observe her. She felt as though her very life, her soul, was being consumed by that gaze, her every moment watched, analyzed, understood by something that shouldn't exist. Her days grew darker, each night bleeding into the next, every shadow a reminder that she was never truly alone. Eventually, she stopped sleeping altogether, her mind fraying, haunted by the specter that would not leave her side. She started seeing those hollow eyes even in daylight, reflected in mirrors, glinting in dark windows, lurking just beyond her vision. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sightings stopped. The house was quiet, no longer filled with the sensation of being watched. She dared to hope it was over, that maybe she'd been imagining things all along. But on her last night in the house, as she packed her things to move away, she found something that made her blood run cold. In her bedroom closet, carved deep into the wood of the walls, were hundreds of tally marks, scratched over and over again as though by fingernails, and above them, scrawled in jagged letters, were the words, "I'm still watching." Nina fled that night, leaving everything behind, determined never to return to Maple Pines. The house remains vacant to this day, but locals say that on certain nights when the moon is low and the wind is quiet, you can still see a figure standing in the window, watching, waiting for someone else to let it in. In the sleepy coastal town of Greystone, there was an old, abandoned lighthouse that everyone seemed to avoid. Perched on a jagged cliff, the lighthouse had stood unused for decades, yet on certain foggy nights, people swore they could see its light flickering in the distance. Locals called it the Lantern Man's Light, claiming it was cursed, a trap for anyone who dared come too close. It was said that the original keeper, a man named Walter Crane, had gone mad in that lighthouse. He'd kept watch for decades, lighting the way for sailors, until one night he simply vanished, leaving only a single blood-stained lantern behind. Some claimed he'd gone to sea in a storm, swept away by the waves. Others said he'd lost his mind and wandered into the woods. But no one knew for sure. His ghost was rumored to haunt the lighthouse, forever keeping watch, lighting the way for souls who could never find their way home. One misty autumn night, a group of teenagers dared each other to explore the lighthouse. Among them were Lucy, her boyfriend Tom, his best friend Jason, and their friend Emma. The thrill of exploring the haunted lighthouse was too tempting, especially with the lure of proving the old legends wrong. They parked their car at the edge of the rocky path leading up to the cliffs. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of salt and decay. As they walked closer, the lighthouse loomed like a dark, skeletal finger pointing toward the sky, shrouded in fog. Despite their excitement, a heavy silence settled over them as they approached the door. It was unlocked, creaking open on rusty hinges. Inside, the air was thick and musty, and their flashlights flickered strangely, casting shadows that seemed to shift on their own. The stairs spiraled upwards into darkness, winding endlessly up the narrow tower. Jason laughed, trying to break the tension. "So, who's ready to meet the Lantern Man?" he joked, but his voice trembled. Lucy rolled her eyes, but even she couldn't shake the eerie feeling of being watched. "Let's just go up to the top and prove nothing's here," she said, leading the way with her flashlight. As they climbed, strange echoes bounced off the walls. It sounded like footsteps, but not from them. It was as if someone were following just a few steps behind. Every now and then, they stopped listening, but the footsteps would fall silent. The higher they climbed, the colder it got. Their breaths hung in the air like mist, and each of them felt an inexplicable heaviness, a pull toward the top of the tower that filled them with dread. Tom gripped Lucy's hand tightly, his face pale in the dim light. About halfway up, they came across an old lantern lying in the middle of the stairs. It was dusty and old, with dried, dark stains on the handle. "Maybe this was his lantern," whispered Emma, picking it up despite the others' protests. The second her hand touched it, the wind outside howled, shaking the tower. A faint, rhythmic thumping sound began to echo around them. It seemed to come from somewhere above, a hollow, metallic tapping, as if something was knocking against the walls. They glanced at each other, and though their nerves were fraying, none of them wanted to be the first to turn back. So they pressed on, each step taking them closer to the source of that strange, hollow sound. Finally, they reached the top floor, the lantern room, where the old light mechanism still sat, covered in dust. It was dark, silent, until Emma held up the lantern they'd found. Without warning, it flared to life, casting an eerie glow that filled the room. They stood in shocked silence, staring at the light that shouldn't have been possible. Then they saw him. Reflected in the grimy windows around them was the faint outline of a man. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in an old keeper's uniform, his face pale and hollow-eyed. In one bony hand, he held a lantern identical to the one Emma had picked up, its ghostly light flickering in time with the flame. The lantern man's eyes locked onto each of them, cold and unblinking. His face twisted into a smile, and he raised the lantern, motioning as if to invite them closer. Lucy stumbled back, her hand reaching for the door, but when she turned, it was gone. The doorway they'd come through was now a solid wall. She looked around wildly, but every window, every exit had vanished. They were trapped in the room with him. The lantern man's expression changed, his smile widening as his mouth opened in a silent scream. The room filled with a piercing, high-pitched wail that tore through their ears. The windows fogged up with a strange, dark mist, and the walls seemed to pulse as if they were alive, closing in on them. Tom grabbed Lucy, trying to shield her, but when he looked down, he saw his hands had begun to fade, his skin turning translucent. Panicking, he looked around at his friends, who were all slowly disappearing, their bodies growing faint and ghostly, becoming part of the lantern man's strange, silent world. Emma dropped the lantern, but it didn't extinguish. It rolled across the floor, casting strange, flickering shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The shadows stretched, dark fingers reaching out to them, pulling them closer to the spectral figure that now loomed in the center of the room. With a final, desperate scream, they tried to run, but it was as though the walls were shifting, bending, trapping them in a never-ending maze within the lighthouse. The lantern man's light grew brighter, filling the room with a blinding, icy glow. One by one, they vanished, their screams swallowed by the darkness. When the town's search party finally found the lighthouse the next day, it was empty. There was no sign of the four friends, only the old lantern lying on the floor in the lantern room, covered in a fresh layer of dust, as though no one had touched it in decades. But locals say that on certain misty nights you can still see shadows in the lighthouse windows, faint, ghostly figures wandering in circles, lost and searching for a way out. And if you listen closely, you might hear them calling for help, their voices mingling with the lonely howl of the wind. The lantern man's light still shines, waiting to draw in those who dare venture too close to his lonely, cursed tower on the cliffs, forever trapping them in his endless watch. In a small, forgotten town at the edge of a deep forest, there was an old story that locals warned outsiders about, a warning that few believed until it was too late. The tale went that a once abandoned home near the woods had become inhabited, not by people, but by something far darker. It was known only as the Silent Clown, and those who claimed to have encountered it never returned with their sanity intact. It began with strange sightings. People passing the old house late at night swore they'd seen the figure of a clown standing motionless in one of the second-floor windows, his painted face frozen in a blank, eerie stare. He wore an outdated costume, torn and soiled, with faded colors that hinted at a time long forgotten. His face was smeared with a thick layer of white, his mouth painted in an enormous red grin that didn't match his empty eyes. One night, a young woman named Lisa, who had recently moved to town, decided to investigate. She was a skeptic, someone who scoffed at ghost stories and superstitions, and the warnings from her new neighbors only made her more curious. Armed with a flashlight and a determination to expose the town's haunted house as nothing more than folklore, she set out alone. As Lisa approached the old house, a chill wrapped around her like a damp, icy blanket, making the hairs on her arms stand up. The front door was ajar, creaking as the wind nudged it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something faintly sweet, like cotton candy gone rotten. She stepped inside, shining her flashlight around the dusty room where the faint outlines of children's toys lay scattered on the floor. Then she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible squeak like the sound of a child's rubber ball being squeezed. She turned toward the staircase, and that's when she saw him. Standing at the top of the stairs, partially hidden in shadow, was the clown. He wasn't looking at her, but his head was cocked at an unnatural angle, his body hunched in a way that seemed wrong, as if he had too many joints. Lisa froze, her breath catching in her throat. She'd thought he would look silly, like a typical clown costume. But something about him was deeply, disturbingly wrong. His costume was ragged and torn, and the painted grin on his face stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. And the eyes, they weren't painted on at all. They were cold and dark, like two hollow pits. Before she could scream, the clown moved, gliding down the stairs with a sound like nails scratching against wood. She backed up, her flashlight flickering, her heart racing, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. He came closer, his body jerking as if it were being pulled by invisible strings. She felt her limbs shaking, her body paralyzed by fear. And then, just as he reached the bottom of the stairs, he stopped. A slow, guttural laugh bubbled from his throat, a sound that seemed to echo through the empty house. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tattered piece of paper, handing it to her with a flourish. Her hand trembled as she took it, eyes never leaving his face. She glanced down at the paper, which had only 2 words scrawled in a messy, childish script. "Tag, you're it." In that instant, the clown disappeared. The house fell silent again, and the lights flickered back to life, but Lisa was alone. Shaking, she stumbled out of the house, her mind reeling, her heart pounding, as the words on the paper seemed to burn into her brain. She tried to shake off the encounter, convince herself it had been some elaborate prank. But that night, as she tried to sleep, she heard something tapping against her bedroom window. She sat up, her skin cold with fear, and saw the clown standing outside, his head tilted, his grin wider than before. She screamed, backing away, but when she blinked, he was gone, leaving nothing but a smear of red paint across the glass. Days passed, and every night he returned, appearing just outside her window, his hollow eyes unblinking, his grin stretching wider, as if he were savoring her fear. Lisa began to unravel, her mind slipping as sleep eluded her, her sanity worn thin by the relentless visits. One morning, her neighbors found her wandering the streets, her hair wild, her hands smeared with red paint, muttering incoherently about the game. She was taken to a hospital, but nothing they did could stop the visions of the clown. He was always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting, watching. In the years since, other people in town claimed to have seen him, standing silently outside their windows, holding that same note that read, "Tag, you're it." No one knew who or what he was or why he chose his victims. But the town began to change. People moved away, boarded up their houses, leaving the area to decay. The forest reclaimed the land, swallowing the old house, and the stories faded into whispers, a cautionary tale to scare children. But some say he's still there, waiting for his next it, waiting for the next soul who dares to enter his territory. They say he can smell fear, that once you see him, he marks you, follows you no matter where you go, appearing in reflections, shadows, and glass windows, his grin stretching wider each time until there's nothing left of you but madness. And as for Lisa, no one knows what happened to her. She simply disappeared one night, leaving nothing behind but a smeared red handprint on her bedroom window, a quiet warning to anyone who might think the stories are just legends. If you ever see a clown's face in a window, they say, don't look too closely, because if you do, you might find a note waiting for you that reads, "Tag, you're it." And from that moment on, you'll never be alone again.